At 79 years old, Caroline Perry stood on a Cleveland sidewalk, watching unfamiliar men carry boxes from the home where she had spent 48 years loving one man and raising two sons. Her husband, William, had been dead for only 17 days. Yet Nathan and Ryan had already sold the house, changed the locks, and informed their mother that she was too old to recognize what was in her best interest. Caroline's hands shook around the handle of her suitcase. Yet her tears were not for the loss of the house. She wept because her sons had overlooked one crucial detail. Hidden behind the basement furnace lay a concealed safe, and William had made her vow to open it only if their boys ever betrayed her. For 48 years, Caroline Perry had maintained that a home was not constructed from brick, wood, or polished floors. A home, she often said, was built from the quiet, unnoticed things: the lunch prepared before dawn, the coat held open in winter, the light left burning for someone returning late, the forgiveness extended before an apology was ever voiced. That was how she had loved her family. Long before the house on Maple Ridge Avenue became valuable to men in tailored suits, it had been a modest, weary place with peeling paint, a leaking roof, and a backyard overrun with weeds. Caroline had been 31 then, with tired feet, hopeful eyes, and a baby boy sleeping against her shoulder. William Perry had stood beside her on the cracked front steps, holding their second son in his arms, and promised they would transform it into something beautiful. Not wealthy, simply beautiful. For nearly half a century, they did. William built Perry and Sons plumbing from the back of an old blue pickup truck. In the beginning, there was no office, no receptionist, no painted sign on the door. There was only William's toolbox, Caroline's handwritten appointment book, and a rotary phone on the kitchen wall that rang at all hours. When pipes burst in January, William went. When elderly neighbors could not afford the bill, Caroline quietly marked the invoices paid. When new families moved onto the block, William introduced himself with a handshake, and Caroline brought over casseroles wrapped in foil. She had never asked for much. A quiet Sunday, a garden with tomatoes, a Christmas when both boys came home and did not argue. But life, as Caroline learned, often gave mothers everything except what they requested. Nathan Perry was the eldest by 3 years. Even as a boy, he had wanted more than the small house could provide. He favored clean shoes, new pencils, shiny watches, and department store windows. When William took him on plumbing calls, Nathan wrinkled his nose at crawl spaces and murky water. He was not cruel then, not exactly. Just embarrassed by need, by labor, by anything that reminded him of his origins. Caroline noticed it early. She saw how Nathan smiled differently around wealthy parents at school. She saw how he hated when William arrived at school events, wearing work boots. She saw how he corrected his father's grammar in front of strangers and pretended not to notice when William's face tightened for half a second. Still, Caroline loved him with the stubborn tenderness of a mother who believed pride was merely fear dressed in a finer coat. Ryan was different. As a child, Ryan followed Caroline from room to room, asking if she needed help. He cried easily, laughed easily, apologized before anyone blamed him. If Nathan reached for the largest slice of pie, Ryan took the smallest and claimed he was not hungry. Caroline worried about that softness. She knew the world could bend gentle people until they mistook bending for love. But she had hoped the brothers would balance each other. Nathan would teach Ryan confidence. Ryan would teach Nathan kindness. For a while, she almost believed it worked. Caroline surrendered her own dreams gradually, not all at once. That was how sacrifice often happened. It did not arrive with dramatic music or a door slamming shut. It came disguised as ordinary necessity. She had once wanted to open a small bakery. She kept recipes in a yellow folder tied with string apple spice cake, brown sugar rolls, lemon cream pie, cinnamon bread with raisins soaked overnight. William used to tell her that one day, when the boys were grown and the business was stable, he would build her a little storefront with blue curtains and a bell over the door. But college came first, then medical bills for William's mother. Then Nathan needed help with law school applications before changing his mind and entering real estate. Then Ryan needed money after losing his first job. Then the house needed a new roof. Then William's knees began aching from years of kneeling under sinks and crawling beneath houses. The bakery folders remained in the kitchen drawer. Caroline never complained, but William noticed, sometimes late at night, when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. He would take her hand across the kitchen table and say, "You gave us your whole life, Carrie." And Caroline would smile and answer, "You were my life." But William always looked sad when she said it, as though he understood something she refused to admit, that love was not supposed to erase a person completely. In the final years of William's life, the neighborhood changed. Old families moved away. Young couples arrived with renovation plans and bright SUVs. Developers began buying houses 2 streets over, turning modest family homes into expensive properties with black windows and white kitchens. Nathan noticed before anyone else did. By then, he had become exactly the man he had once admired from a distance. He wore tailored coats, spoke polished phrases, and carried himself like every room owed him attention. His real estate business had grown quickly, though Caroline never fully understood how. Nathan always talked about investors, partnerships, leverage, and opportunity. He used words that made greed sound intelligent. Ryan, meanwhile, drifted through life with a nervous smile and bills he never explained. He had worked in insurance, then car sales, then property management under Nathan. Each time Caroline asked if he was doing all right, he said, "I'm fine, Mom," too quickly. William heard more than he said. He had always been a quiet man, but in the last year before his death, his silence changed. It grew heavier. Sometimes Caroline found him in the basement standing near the old furnace with his hand resting against the wall behind it. When she asked what he was doing, he would say he was checking a draft or looking at the gas line. Once she came downstairs and found him sliding a metal panel back into place behind the furnace. He turned too quickly, guilt flashing across his face. "William?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked over, took both her hands, and spoke words she never forgot. "If the boys ever make you feel unsafe in this house, you come down here behind the furnace. There's something hidden. Don't open it unless you have to." Caroline stared at him, confused and frightened. "What are you talking about?" But William only kissed her forehead. "I pray you never need to know." At the time, Caroline thought grief had already begun haunting him. His heart was weak. His body was tired. Perhaps illness had made him fearful. Perhaps he had seen too many stories on the news about families fighting after funerals. She wanted to believe that, because believing anything else meant admitting their sons might one day become strangers. Then William died on a gray Thursday morning in early March. It was quiet. Caroline woke before dawn and knew before she touched his hand. The room felt different, emptied of something larger than breath. William lay beside her with his face turned toward the window, peaceful in a way that broke her heart. She whispered his name once, then again. Then she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and made a sound so small and wounded that even the house seemed to hold still. At the funeral, Nathan stood straight in a black suit and accepted condolences like he was managing a public event. Ryan cried behind sunglasses. Caroline sat between them, feeling both sons near her yet impossibly far away. For 3 days after the burial, neighbors brought food. Women from church hugged Caroline and told her William had been a good man. Old customers stood on the porch with tears in their eyes, saying he had fixed their pipes, saved their basements, helped their fathers, and refused payment when times were hard. Nathan looked impatient through all of it. Caroline noticed, but grief made her slow. On the 4th day, Nathan arrived with a leather folder. "Mum," he said gently, though his gentleness had edges, "we need to simplify things." Ryan sat beside him at the kitchen table, eyes lowered. Caroline was still wearing William's old cardigan over her nightgown. She had barely eaten. The house smelled of lilies from the funeral and coffee gone cold. "What things?" she asked. "Financial things," Nathan replied. "The house, Dad's business records, insurance, property taxes. You don't need to carry all that stress." Caroline looked at Ryan. He smiled weakly. "Nathan knows what he's doing, Mom." That sentence hurt more than it should have. Nathan slid papers across the table. He explained them too quickly. Power of attorney language, estate management, temporary authorization, property evaluation. Caroline heard fragments, but not the whole. Her mind was full of William's empty chair. "I don't want to sign anything today," she said. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Mom, waiting will only make things harder. I just buried your father, and Dad would want us to protect you." The words were perfect. That was the problem. They sounded like love, but Caroline felt no warmth in them. She signed 2 forms that day because Ryan touched her wrist and whispered, "Please, Mom, it's just paperwork." She did not sign the rest. Something inside her resisted, some small surviving part of herself that grief had not drowned. Nathan left angry, though he covered it with a kiss on her cheek. Over the next week, he called daily. He talked about market timing, rising property values, medical planning, senior care, maintenance costs. He told her the house was too much for a woman her age. He said stairs were dangerous. He said the furnace was outdated. He said she could fall. He said she could forget something on the stove. Every sentence sounded like concern. Every sentence made Caroline feel smaller. Ryan came by once with groceries and would not meet her eyes. When Caroline asked him directly whether Nathan was planning to sell the house, Ryan froze. "No," he said, but his voice broke on the word. That night, Caroline walked through every room after midnight. She touched the banister William had sanded by hand. She stood in the doorway of Nathan's old bedroom, remembering baseball cards and spelling trophies. She opened Ryan's closet and found an old paper star he had made in 2nd grade with the words, "My mom is my hero," written in crooked blue crayon. She held it against her chest and wept. Not because her sons had grown up, but because somewhere along the way, they had forgotten who had carried them there. The next morning, Caroline saw the sign. It stood in the front yard beneath the maple tree William had planted when Nathan was born. Sold. For a moment, her mind refused to understand it. She stood behind the living room curtain in her slippers, staring at the red letters, as if they belonged to someone else's life. A young couple stood on the sidewalk with a realtor pointing toward the porch. Caroline opened the front door. The realtor turned, startled. "Mrs. Perry." Caroline's mouth went dry. "What is that sign doing in my yard?" The woman hesitated. "I'm sorry. I thought your sons had informed you. The closing is scheduled for next week." Caroline gripped the door frame. Behind her, the house seemed to breathe with every memory she had ever placed inside it. Next week. William had been gone less than 3 weeks, and her sons had already sold the roof over her head. That was when Caroline understood she was no longer their mother in their eyes. She was an obstacle. and somewhere beneath the basement behind the old furnace. William's warning waited like a heartbeat in the dark. The movers arrived at 8:30 in the morning. Caroline Perry heard the truck before she saw it. The low, grinding engine echoed through Maple Ridge Avenue, while pale sunlight crept across the living room floor. For one strange moment, half asleep in William's old cardigan, Caroline thought it might be him returning from an early plumbing call, as he had done 1,000 times before. Then she remembered William was dead, and the house no longer belonged to her. She sat frozen at the kitchen table as the moving truck parked beside the curb. Outside, men in dark jackets stepped onto the sidewalk carrying clipboards and boxes of packing tape. Their voices sounded casual. One of them laughed at something another said. Caroline stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. It suddenly occurred to her that grief did not stop the world. Men still drank coffee. Neighbors still walked dogs. Traffic lights still changed. And sons still betrayed mothers while the grass continued growing outside the window. A sharp knock sounded at the front door. Caroline did not move immediately. Her chest tightened with a feeling she could not fully name: fear, perhaps, or humiliation. Maybe both. The knock came again, this time harder. She rose slowly and crossed the hallway. When she opened the door, Nathan Perry stood on the porch wearing a charcoal overcoat and polished leather shoes. His expression carried the same controlled patience he used during business meetings. Behind him stood Ryan. Unlike his brother, Ryan looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders tense beneath a wrinkled jacket. He avoided looking directly at Caroline. "Nathan," she whispered, "what is all this?" Nathan stepped inside without answering. "We need to move quickly today, Mom." The word, "Mom," sounded rehearsed. The movers waited outside while Nathan laid a stack of papers across the dining room table, like a banker finalizing a transaction. Caroline looked from the papers to the strangers on her lawn. "You said the sale wasn't finalized yet." "It is now," Nathan replied calmly. "Closing happened yesterday afternoon." Her stomach dropped. "You sold my house." "Our house," Nathan corrected. "Technically, part of Dad's estate." Caroline stared at him in disbelief. "Your father hasn't even been gone 3 weeks. Nathan exhaled sharply. "Mom, please don't do this emotionally." The words struck her harder than shouting would have, as though grief itself had become an inconvenience. Ryan finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Nathan's just trying to help." Caroline turned toward him. "Help who?" Neither son answered. Nathan opened the folder and tapped several highlighted pages. "The market is hot right now. Keeping this property would have been financially irresponsible. The taxes alone. This is my home, and you can't maintain it alone. I have lived here nearly 50 years. You've also fallen twice in the last 6 months." That was ice on the porch. Nathan's jaw tightened. "Mom, listen to yourself. This place is outdated. The stairs are dangerous. The plumbing needs work. The furnace is ancient." At the mention of the furnace, something flickered inside Caroline's chest. A memory. William standing in the basement. William's hand against the hidden panel. William's voice saying, "If the boys ever make you feel unsafe in this house." Caroline looked toward the basement door without meaning to. Nathan noticed. "What?" "Nothing," he continued speaking. "We found you a facility outside Columbus. It's clean, affordable, professional." "A facility," Caroline whispered. "It's temporary until we sort everything else out." Ryan finally looked up. Guilt flooded his face before he lowered his eyes again. Caroline suddenly understood something terrible. This conversation had been planned long ago. Not during the funeral, not after William died. Before. The realization hollowed her from the inside. "Nathan," she said quietly, "when did you decide to get rid of me?" His expression hardened instantly. This isn't about getting rid of anyone. Then why does it feel like strangers are coming to erase my life? Nathan rubbed his forehead impatiently. Mum, please stop making this dramatic. The movers began carrying boxes toward the porch. Caroline watched one of them remove old fishing rods from the hallway closet. Another picked up framed family photographs. 48 years of memories reduced to inventory. No, Caroline said suddenly. Everyone paused. Nathan blinked. What? No. I'm not leaving. For the first time, real anger appeared in Nathan's face. You don't have a choice. The silence after those words felt monstrous. Ryan looked physically sick. Caroline stepped backward slowly, gripping the back of a dining chair to steady herself. I raised you boys in this house. Nathan crossed his arms. And we're trying to protect you. Be throwing me away? That's not fair. No. Her voice trembled. Your father dies and suddenly I'm too old to matter. Nathan's restraint finally cracked. You can barely manage your medications without help. Caroline flinched. Outside, one of the movers awkwardly looked away. Nathan continued, louder now. You don't understand finances. You don't understand legal paperwork. Dad handled everything because you never learned how. The cruelty of it landed slowly. Not because it was entirely false, but because Caroline had spent her whole life trusting the people she loved instead of protecting herself from them. William handled bills because she trusted William. She signed papers because she trusted family. She gave her life to motherhood because she believed love meant permanence. Now her own son stood in front of her using that trust as evidence she was weak. Ryan whispered, Nathan, stop. But Nathan was no longer listening. We're doing what's practical. Practical. That word again, as though practicality excused betrayal. Caroline looked around the kitchen. The faded curtain she had sewn by hand. The scratch on the wall from Ryan's bicycle accident when he was 11. The small stain near the stove where William once dropped an entire pot of chili and laughed until he cried. A whole lifetime lived inside these walls. And to Nathan, it was just property. One of the movers entered carrying cardboard boxes. He was younger than the others, broad, shouldered with tired eyes and work gloves tucked into his back pocket. His name tag read, Tom Bradley. He paused after seeing Caroline's face. Quietly, he asked, Mom, where would you like us to place your personal items? Nathan answered before she could. Just pack everything essential. 2 suitcases only. Tom frowned slightly. Only 2. That's all the facility allows initially. Facility. The word sounded like prison now. Caroline's hands began trembling. She could feel herself disappearing in front of strangers. Not dying. Disappearing. Like a person erased while still breathing. Then suddenly, through the fog of humiliation, she remembered the basement, the safe, William's warning. Caroline lifted her chin slightly. I want one last moment downstairs. Nathan immediately shook his head. No, please. There's no reason for that. Her pulse quickened. There are things down there that belong to your father. We'll sort through them later. There may not be a later. Nathan stepped closer. Mom, enough. But Tom Bradley interrupted carefully. Sir, the crew needs clarification about the garage inventory forms. Nathan turned sharply, irritated. Now. They need signatures before loading tools and machinery. Nathan muttered under his breath and walked it toward the porch with Tom following behind. Ryan remained in the kitchen. Caroline looked at him. For one aching second, she saw the little boy who once cried when a bird hit their window. Ryan, she whispered. Did you know? His eyes filled instantly, but he still did not answer. That silence was answer enough. Caroline turned away before he could see her break. She moved quickly toward the basement door, her knees aching with every step. Behind her, voices drifted from outside while movers carried boxes through the hallway. The basement smelled exactly the same: dust, metal, old concrete. William's tools still hung neatly on the pegboard wall. The furnace stood in the corner beneath a dim yellow bulb. Caroline approached slowly, her breath shallow. For years she had ignored William's strange warning, because loving mothers trained themselves not to imagine evil inside their children. Now she reached behind the furnace with trembling hands. Her fingers brushed cold metal. The hidden panel was still there. A wave of emotion crashed through her so violently she nearly collapsed. William had known. Dear God, some part of him had known. Tears filled her eyes as she rested her forehead against the furnace. "What did you see?" she whispered into the silence. Footsteps sounded upstairs. Caroline quickly slid the panel back into place. She did not open the safe, not yet. Instead, she straightened slowly and wiped her face. For the first time since William died, grief was no longer the only thing inside her. Now there was something else, a terrible understanding. Her husband had tried to protect her from their own sons, and whatever waited inside that hidden safe was powerful enough that William trusted it more than the children he had raised. Upstairs, Nathan called impatiently, "Mom, we need to go." Caroline took one last look at the basement before climbing the stairs. When she reached the front door, 2 suitcases waited beside the porch. Everything else in her life remained inside the house. Nathan grabbed the car keys. Ryan stood pale and silent near the sidewalk. The movers avoided looking directly at her. Caroline stepped onto the porch slowly. The cold March wind cut through her sweater. Behind her, the front door of the Perry home remained open while strangers carried away pieces of her past. But hidden beneath the house behind the old furnace, William's secret still waited in darkness. And for the first time in her life, Caroline Perry walked away, carrying not only heartbreak, but a reason to survive. The bus station smelled like burned coffee, wet newspapers, and exhaustion. Caroline Perry sat alone beneath flickering fluorescent lights with 2 suitcases at her feet, and 243 hidden inside her coat pocket. Outside, Cleveland disappeared beneath cold March rain, while travelers rushed past her without noticing the elderly widow sitting perfectly still near Gate 12. For most of her life, Caroline had never traveled alone. William drove everywhere. If they visited family, William drove. If they went to church retreats, William drove. If they escaped for rare weekend trips near Lake Erie, William drove. With one hand on the wheel, while old country songs crackled softly through the radio. Now Caroline stared at the departure board through tired eyes, trying to remember when the world had become so loud and confusing. Pine Hollow, 10:40 p.m. The letters glowed above the terminal like a doorway into another life. She still remembered the day William first mentioned Pine Hollow. It had been nearly 14 years earlier. Nathan was already working in real estate. Ryan had just lost another job. William returned home unusually quiet after a 3-day plumbing contract in rural Pennsylvania. At dinner, he unfolded a worn paper map across the kitchen table. "There's a little town out there called Pine Hollow," he had said softly. "Mountains, forests, quiet roads. Feels like the kind of place people go when they're tired of fighting the world." Caroline smiled faintly at the memory. "And what would we do there?" William grinned. "Grow tomatoes, fix old things, maybe finally build you that bakery." She laughed at him then. But later that night, she found him sitting alone at the kitchen table studying the map again, with a strange seriousness in his eyes. A few months later, he quietly bought a small piece of land there. Caroline remembered asking why. William only answered, "Because everyone deserves somewhere safe." At the time, she thought he meant retirement. Now, sitting alone in the bus terminal, after being thrown out by her own sons, Caroline wondered if William had meant something far darker. The bus ride lasted nearly 9 hours. Caroline barely slept. Rain streaked across the windows while highway lights drifted through darkness like fading memories. Around midnight, the young woman beside her fell asleep with headphones over her ears. Somewhere in the back, a baby cried softly before finally quieting. Caroline rested her forehead against the cold glass. For the first time since William died, there were no voices around her telling her what to do. No Nathan explaining finances. No Ryan whispering apologies he did not mean strongly enough to act upon. Only silence and grief and William's hidden warning beneath the basement furnace. Near dawn, the scenery began changing. The gray industrial edges of Ohio disappeared behind endless hills wrapped in fog. Rusted factories became forests. Concrete became winding roads lined with pine trees and weathered fences. Tiny towns appeared between mountains, like forgotten pieces of America the modern world had skipped over. Caroline watched everything carefully. The beauty hurt because she realized how long it had been since she noticed anything beyond responsibility. By the time the bus reached Pine Hollow, her back ached, her hands trembled from fatigue, and her heart felt hollowed out by loss. The station itself was barely more than a wooden shelter beside a narrow road. No taxis waited. No crowds gathered. Only cold mountain wind and silence. The driver unloaded her suitcases onto damp gravel before pulling away without ceremony. Then Caroline Perry stood completely alone. Pine Hollow was smaller than she remembered from William's stories. One diner sat across the road beside an old gas station with faded signs hanging crooked in the windows. A church steeple rose beyond the trees. Smoke drifted lazily from a few chimneys in the distance. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, Caroline suddenly felt terrified. What was she doing here? She was 79 years old, homeless, widowed, abandoned, standing in a town where nobody knew her name. For one dangerous moment, she nearly turned back toward the empty road and imagined calling Nathan. Not because she trusted him, but because fear made humiliation feel safer than uncertainty. Then she remembered the expression on Nathan's face when he said, "You don't have a choice." Something hardened quietly inside her. Yes, she thought, I do. An old pickup truck rattled into the station parking lot just after sunrise. The driver was a heavy-set man in a brown flannel jacket. "You Caroline Perry?" he asked through the open window. She blinked in surprise. "Yes. Name's Earl Simmons. Used to help your husband with repairs sometimes. William called last year asking if I'd check on the property every couple months." Caroline's breath caught. "Last year." Earl nodded casually. "He said you might come someday." The words struck her harder than she expected. William had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Earl loaded her suitcases into the truck bed while Caroline climbed carefully into the passenger seat. The road to the farmhouse twisted through dense pine forests and narrow hillsides. Fallen branches lined muddy ditches from recent storms. After nearly 20 minutes, Earl finally slowed near an overgrown dirt path almost hidden between trees. "There she is," he said gently. Caroline stared through the windshield. The farmhouse looked exhausted. Broken shutters hung crooked against faded blue siding. Several windows were boarded shut. The porch sagged noticeably on one side. Tall weeds swallowed the fence posts. One corner of the roof had partially collapsed inward. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Earl sighed. William always meant to fix it proper. Caroline stepped slowly from the truck. The cold mountain air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. She walked toward the porch carefully, her shoes sinking slightly into mud. The front door creaked open after 2 hard pushes. Dust floated through pale morning sunlight. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. An old wood stove stood near the kitchen wall. A faded blanket covered a rocking chair beside the fireplace. Rusted tools hung neatly above a workbench. Shelves held canned vegetables, lanterns, and jars of nails carefully labeled in William's handwriting. Caroline touched one of the jars with trembling fingers. He had prepared this place, not completely, not perfectly, but intentionally. Earl helped carry her suitcases inside before removing his cap awkwardly. "Town's got a diner down the road if you need food," he said. "Folks here mostly keep to themselves, but they respected William." Caroline swallowed hard. "Thank you for bringing me." He nodded once before heading back toward his truck. At the door, he paused. "Your husband wasn't the kind of man who did things without reason, Mrs. Perry." Then he left. The silence afterward felt enormous. Caroline wandered slowly through the farmhouse. Every room carried traces of unfinished plans. A stack of lumber leaned against the hallway wall. Plumbing pipes waited unopened near the kitchen sink. A handwritten list titled, "Spring Repairs," remained pinned beside the fireplace. Her chest tightened painfully. William had imagined them growing old here together. Not like this. Never like this. By afternoon, exhaustion began overtaking grief. The farmhouse had no central heat. The kitchen sink barely worked. The refrigerator hummed weakly, but produced little cold air. Dust coated nearly every surface. Still, Caroline refused to collapse. She tied her gray hair back with an old ribbon from her suitcase and began cleaning. One room, just one room. That became her goal. She swept floors until her shoulders burned. She washed dishes with freezing water. She opened windows to clear stale air despite the cold wind biting her hands. By sunset, the small kitchen looked almost livable. Not beautiful, not comfortable, but alive. Caroline lit the old wood stove using newspaper, and kindling Earl had stacked beside the porch years earlier. Warm orange light slowly filled the room, while darkness swallowed the forest outside. For dinner, she ate canned soup directly from the pot. Then she sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the wind move through pine trees beyond the walls. For the first time in weeks, nobody was rushing her. Nobody was lying to her. Nobody was treating her like a burden. The loneliness still hurt. William's absence still felt unbearable. But beneath the grief, another feeling slowly emerged: relief. That realization frightened her more than anything else. Late that night, Caroline wrapped herself in blankets beside the stove. As she reached down to place another piece of wood into the firebox, something caught her eye. Beneath the kitchen counter, a small tin container hidden behind loose paneling. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, she reached for it. Inside were spare keys, folded receipts, and one handwritten note in William's careful script. Only 6 words. "If you made it here, survive." Caroline covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Outside, wind howled through the dark forests of Pine Hollow. But inside the broken farmhouse, for the first time since losing everything, Caroline Perry no longer felt abandoned. She felt guided. The first snow arrived 3 days after Caroline Perry found William's note hidden beneath the kitchen counter. Tiny white flakes drifted through the pine trees surrounding the farmhouse, covering broken fence posts, dead weeds, and fragile silence. From the kitchen window, the mountains looked softer beneath the gray winter sky, almost peaceful. But inside Caroline's chest, nothing felt peaceful anymore. William had known. That truth followed her everywhere now. It followed her while she swept dust from warped floorboards. It followed her while she struggled to carry firewood across the frozen porch. It followed her during sleepless nights, when wind rattled the old farmhouse walls like restless ghosts. Most painful of all, it followed her whenever she thought about her sons. Because no matter how much Nathan had hurt her, no matter how deeply Ryan had disappointed her, part of Caroline still remembered them as boys. Nathan at age 7, running through sprinklers barefoot. Ryan asleep, beside the family dog after Christmas dinner, William teaching both boys how to throw baseballs in the backyard, while Caroline watched from the porch, holding lemonade. How did memories like that become men capable of betrayal? The question haunted her constantly. On the fourth morning in Pine Hollow, Caroline woke before sunrise because of the cold. The fire in the wood stove had nearly died during the night, leaving frost creeping along the edges of the kitchen windows. Her joints screamed with pain as she stood. In Cleveland, she had complained when the water heater took too long. Here, she heated water manually in old metal pots just to wash her hands. Still, something stubborn inside her refused to surrender. Perhaps survival itself had become an act of defiance. She wrapped herself in William's flannel jacket and began organizing the kitchen shelves. Most of the farmhouse supplies were old but usable: canned beans, rice, tools, nails, oil lamps, batteries. William had prepared more carefully than she first realized. As Caroline sorted through dusty jars near the pantry corner, her hand brushed against something hidden behind a stack of flour tins. A small wooden box. She frowned. The box looked old, worn smooth at the edges from years of use. Her pulse quickened slightly as she lifted it onto the kitchen table. There was no lock, only a folded envelope resting inside. Caroline froze the moment she recognized the handwriting. William. Her fingers trembled so badly, she struggled to open it. For several seconds, she simply stared at the paper, overcome by the terrible ache of seeing his handwriting again. It felt intimate in a way grief had stolen from her, like hearing his footsteps in another room. Finally, she unfolded the letter carefully. "My Carrie, if you are reading this, then something has already gone wrong. I prayed every day you would never need to find these letters. But prayers do not always stop people from becoming who they choose to become." Caroline covered her mouth instantly. Tears blurred the words. She sat slowly at the kitchen table while snow drifted outside the windows. "I need you to know something before anything else. None of this is your fault. You loved our boys the way good mothers do. Completely. Maybe too completely. You believed love could fix weakness before weakness turned into greed. I wanted to believe that, too." Caroline closed her eyes. The words hurt because they were true. William had always understood people more clearly than she did. Caroline saw goodness first. William saw danger first. Together they had balanced each other. Until now. She continued reading. "About 6 years ago, I discovered money missing from the business accounts. At first, I assumed it was bookkeeping mistakes. Then I found forged signatures." Caroline's breathing slowed. "Nathan denied everything when I confronted him. He was calm. Too calm. He explained every missing dollar so smoothly, I almost believed him. But later, Ryan came to me privately and admitted Nathan had pressured him to help move money between accounts." Caroline stared at the page in disbelief. Ryan knew. Dear God, Ryan had known for years. Ryan cried while telling me. Said Nathan promised he would pay everything back after a property deal closed. Ryan begged me not to call the police because Nathan said it would destroy the family. A broken sound escaped Caroline's throat. She could picture it perfectly: Ryan panicking, Nathan persuading, William carrying the burden silently, and Caroline unaware in the kitchen making dinner, while the family she protected slowly cracked apart around her. William's words continued. "I wanted to believe it was temporary greed, temporary weakness. I thought maybe becoming fathers themselves someday would humble them. But Nathan kept changing. He began speaking about people the way businessmen discuss furniture: useful or not useful, valuable or not valuable. Outside, snow struck the windows softly. Inside the farmhouse, Caroline felt something cold settling into her bones. Not fear, recognition. She remembered Nathan's expression during the argument in Cleveland. Not guilt, calculation. William had seen it years earlier. I bought this farmhouse because I needed somewhere beyond Nathan's reach. Somewhere you could survive if things ever became dangerous after my death. Caroline's hands shook violently now. Dangerous. William truly believed their sons might one day hurt her. The thought felt unbearable. She read further. The safe behind the basement furnace contains evidence. Real evidence. Financial records, property documents, signed confessions, things Nathan never knew I collected. Caroline inhaled sharply. So the safe was real, not just money, proof. But there is something else inside that safe, Carrie. Something painful. Something I hid from you, because I knew it would break your heart before it freed you. Her stomach tightened immediately. What could possibly hurt more than this already did? William's next line seemed almost heavier than the rest. I'm sorry for keeping secrets from you. I told myself I was protecting your peace. Maybe I was really protecting my own. Caroline wiped tears from her face. For a moment, she hated him slightly for that sentence. Not because he lied, but because he had carried this burden alone. Marriage was supposed to mean shared pain. But William had chosen silence instead. And now silence was all she had left from him. The final section of the letter was written more shakily. His health must already have been failing. If Nathan has forced you out, if Ryan stayed silent, then listen carefully to me now. Do not go back there alone. Trust actions, not apologies. And most importantly, Carrie, stop believing you must destroy yourself to keep your children comfortable. Caroline stared at those words for a very long time. Stop believing you must destroy yourself. The sentence reached into something deep inside her, because she had done exactly that her entire life. Every sacrifice, every excuse, every forgiveness, every time she made herself smaller so someone else could remain comfortable, she suddenly realized something devastating. Nathan had not become selfish overnight. Ryan had not become weak overnight. The family had been bending toward this collapse for years, while Caroline kept pretending love alone would hold everything together. The letter slipped slightly in her trembling hands as she reached the final lines. There is still enough left for you to survive. More importantly, there is still enough left for you to live. I loved you before this family existed, Carrie. Don't disappear after it breaks. William. The farmhouse fell silent again. Only the crackling stove disturbed the stillness. Caroline lowered the letter slowly onto the table and began to cry with a grief deeper than the funeral had allowed. Not loud crying, not dramatic, the kind that came from 48 years of loving one life so completely that losing it felt like losing herself. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Pine Hollow. Hours passed before Caroline finally moved again. When she stood, her knees trembled from exhaustion. But something inside her had changed. The letter had not healed her. It had awakened her. Nathan thought she was weak because she trusted people. Ryan thought guilt without action still counted as goodness. But William had believed she could survive this. Caroline walked slowly toward the window overlooking the frozen trees. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, she no longer felt like a discarded widow hiding from humiliation. Now she felt like a woman standing at the beginning of something painful and necessary. Somewhere back in Cleveland, behind the basement furnace, the rest of William's truth still waited, and Caroline Perry finally understood. The hidden safe was not just protection. It was a door. Pine Hollow woke slowly each morning. Unlike Cleveland, where sirens and traffic began before sunrise, this little mountain town stretched itself awake with patience. Smoke curled from chimneys. Old trucks rattled down narrow roads. Wind moved softly through endless rows of pine trees that surrounded the valley like protective walls. For Caroline Perry, the silence still felt unfamiliar, but no longer frightening. 2 weeks had passed since she arrived at the farmhouse, and though the place remained rough and unfinished, it was beginning to feel less like a shelter and more like survival. The kitchen floor no longer creaked dangerously, because Caroline had repaired loose boards using old nails William left behind. The wood stove now stayed lit most nights. Earl Simmons helped patch part of the leaking roof after a storm nearly flooded the hallway. Little by little, the abandoned farmhouse began breathing again. And so did Caroline. Not fully, not happily, but enough to keep moving. Each morning she forced herself into routine. She swept the porch, carried firewood, heated water, repaired curtains with trembling hands that still ached from arthritis. Some tasks took her 3 times longer than they once would have. Still, every finished task mattered, because after being treated like helpless furniture by her own sons, proving she could survive alone became deeply personal. One icy afternoon, Caroline finally gathered enough courage to visit the diner Earl had mentioned. The building sat beside the main road with a faded sign reading, Hayes Family Diner. Warm yellow light glowed through fogged windows, while the smell of bacon and coffee drifted into the cold air outside. Caroline hesitated before opening the door. For a moment, she almost turned around. Humiliation had changed her more than she realized. Since Nathan threw her out, even entering unfamiliar places made her feel exposed, as though strangers could somehow see abandonment written across her face. But the freezing wind pushed her forward. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as she stepped inside. Conversation paused briefly, not rudely, just curiosity. Pine Hollow was the kind of town where unfamiliar faces were noticed immediately. A middle-aged waitress carrying a coffee pot approached with tired but kind eyes. "You passing through, honey?" Caroline swallowed. "No. I suppose I live here now." The waitress smiled gently. "Well, then you picked the coldest week possible." A few customers chuckled quietly. Something about the warmth of ordinary humor eased the tightness in Caroline's chest. The waitress extended her hand. "Margaret Hayes." "Caroline Perry." Margaret froze slightly. "Perry." Caroline nodded. "My husband was William Perry." For the second time since arriving in Pine Hollow, someone reacted to William's name with immediate recognition. Margaret's entire expression softened.
"Oh my goodness,"
she whispered. "Bill Perry's wife." Caroline blinked in surprise. "You knew him?" "Knew him." Margaret laughed softly. "That man repaired half this town without charging people." Several customers nearby overheard and turned toward Caroline. An older man near the counter raised his coffee cup slightly. "Bill fixed my water heater during the blizzard back in '89, he said. Another woman added, "He repaired the church roof after the storm and never sent a bill." Someone else muttered agreement. Caroline stood frozen beneath the warmth of strangers, speaking her husband's name with affection. In Cleveland, William's funeral had already faded from public memory. Nathan treated his father's death like a legal inconvenience. Ryan barely answered phone calls anymore. But here, William still existed inside people's gratitude. Margaret guided Caroline toward a booth near the window. "You sit," she said firmly. "Coffee's on the house." Caroline tried protesting. Margaret ignored her completely. 10 minutes later, Caroline sat wrapped around a mug of hot coffee while snow drifted outside the diner windows. The simple warmth nearly made her cry. Margaret slid a plate of soup onto the table. "You're staying at Bill's farmhouse?" "Yes. That old place has needed saving for 20 years. Caroline smiled faintly. "I think it may kill me before I save it." Margaret laughed loudly enough to turn heads. "Well, then you're officially local now." The laughter felt good. Not polite laughter, not forced, real. Caroline realized she had not truly laughed since William died. Over the following days, Pine Hollow slowly unfolded around her. Margaret introduced her to people carefully, almost protectively. The town hardware store owner gave Caroline discounted supplies after learning whose wife she was. A teenage boy from the church volunteered to clear snow from her porch. Even the librarian, a quiet woman named Nora Bennett, greeted Caroline warmly after hearing William's name. "Your husband used to spend hours here reading local history books," Nora said one afternoon while helping Caroline search for property maps. "Never mentioned that." Nora smiled knowingly. William Perry didn't talk much about the things he did. That sentence stayed with Caroline long after she left the library, because the deeper she looked into William's hidden life in Pine Hollow, the more she realized how much of himself he had quietly given away. One evening, Margaret drove Caroline home after the diner closed early because of heavy snow. As the truck climbed the narrow road toward the farmhouse, Margaret glanced sideways at her. "You mind if I ask something personal?" Caroline looked out the frosted window. "I suppose not. What brought you here alone?" The question lingered heavily between them. Caroline considered lying, saying she wanted peace, saying retirement plans changed after William's death. But exhaustion had worn her honesty raw. "My son sold my house after my husband died," she said quietly. Margaret's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "They what?" "They said it was for my own good." Silence filled the truck. Finally, Margaret muttered, "That's evil." Caroline flinched slightly at the word, not because she disagreed, but because hearing someone else say it made the betrayal feel real in a way she still struggled to accept. Margaret continued softly, "Bill knew, didn't he?" Caroline turned sharply.
What do you mean?
That something was wrong with those boys. The question unsettled her deeply, because yes, William had known, and now other people seemed to realize it too. Caroline stared down at her gloved hands. "I think he tried to protect me." Margaret nodded slowly, unsurprised. When they reached the farmhouse, Margaret cut the engine but did not leave immediately. "You know something," she said. Caroline looked at her. "People think surviving betrayal means becoming hard." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the dark farmhouse. "But the hardest thing in the world is staying soft without letting evil destroy you." The word settled deep inside Caroline because she feared exactly that. Not losing money, not losing houses, losing herself. Nathan's cruelty had already planted bitterness inside her heart. Sometimes at night, anger kept her awake longer than grief did. Part of her wanted revenge. Part of her wanted Nathan to suffer publicly, the way she suffered privately. And that frightened her. After Margaret left, Caroline entered the farmhouse slowly. The fire inside the stove had nearly gone out. Wind rattled against the walls, while shadows stretched across the kitchen floor. As she bent to add another log to the fire, she noticed something tucked beneath the wood box near the hearth, a folded receipt, old, yellowed with age. Caroline frowned and unfolded it carefully. It was from a local bank in Pine Hollow, dated 11 years earlier. Attached to it was a handwritten note from William. "Community well payment completed. Don't tell anyone." Caroline stared at the paper in confusion. The next morning, she carried the receipt to the diner and showed Margaret. Margaret's eyes widened immediately. "Oh my Lord, what is it?" Margaret lowered her voice. "About 12 years ago, developers tried buying the old community well outside town, planned to shut it down and force everyone onto private water contracts." Caroline listened carefully. Nobody here could afford the legal fight. Margaret continued. "Then suddenly the overdue payments disappeared. The well stayed public. Nobody ever knew who paid it off. She looked directly at Caroline. Until now. Caroline felt tears gathering unexpectedly. William had never told her any of this, not because he wanted praise, but because helping people quietly had simply been who he was. For the first time since his death, Caroline no longer remembered only the pain of losing him. Now she remembered the scale of his goodness, and slowly, painfully, she began understanding something else, too. William had not sent her to Pine Hollow merely to hide. He had sent her somewhere she would be remembered as human. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Cleveland, Nathan Perry stood inside his expensive downtown office, staring at an empty file folder. The senior living facility had finally returned his calls. His mother had never arrived, and for the first time since selling the house, genuine panic began creeping beneath Nathan's polished confidence. Because if Caroline Perry disappeared, so did his control over everything William left behind. The snowstorm began just after midnight. Wind slammed against the farmhouse walls hard enough to wake Caroline Perry from sleep. She sat upright beneath heavy blankets, disoriented for a moment, listening to branches scrape across the roof like fingernails. The fire in the stove had burned low again. Cold air drifted through cracks in the old windows. Caroline slowly pushed herself out of bed, wincing as pain shot through her knees. Living in Pine Hollow had reminded her daily that age was real. Every staircase hurt. Every bucket of water cost energy she no longer naturally possessed, but pain no longer embarrassed her. Not after what her sons had done. She wrapped herself in William's old flannel jacket and fed wood carefully into the stove. Orange light flickered across the kitchen while snow battered the dark world outside. Then she noticed headlights approaching through the storm. Caroline froze. Nobody visited this late. Fear tightened her chest instantly, for one terrible second. She imagined Nathan standing outside the farmhouse. She reached for the poker beside the stove before forcing herself toward the window. The truck pulling into the driveway belonged to Margaret Hayes. Relief nearly made her knees buckle. A moment later, loud knocking shook the front door.
Caroline!
Margaret shouted over the wind. Open! Open up! Caroline hurried across the room and pulled the door open against the storm. Margaret stepped inside, carrying snow across her boots, along with another man Caroline had never seen before. He looked to be in his late 60s, tall and lean with silver hair beneath a wool coat. Sorry for the hour, Margaret said breathlessly. Road conditions are getting worse. Figured you shouldn't be alone tonight. Caroline blinked in surprise. You drove all the way here in this weather. Margaret gave her a look. That's what decent people do. The simple sentence struck Caroline harder than expected, because lately she had begun forgetting what decent people looked like. Margaret removed her gloves and pointed toward the man beside her. This is Caleb Whitmore, retired attorney. He knew William pretty well. Caleb extended his hand gently. Your husband spoke about you often. Caroline shook his hand carefully. Please sit down before you both freeze. Within minutes, the kitchen warmed with conversation and coffee. Margaret unpacked sandwiches wrapped in cloth while Caleb studied the farmhouse quietly. Bill repaired the stove himself, he said finally. Caroline looked surprised. You knew he worked on the house. Caleb nodded. He came through Pine Hollow several times over the years, usually alone, sometimes stayed a week or two. Caroline stared into her coffee. William had hidden entire pieces of his life from her. Not affairs, not betrayal, preparation. Still it hurt. Caleb seemed to sense her thoughts. He loved you deeply, Caroline. Her eyes lifted slowly. Then why keep secrets? The older man sighed. Because men like William often mistake protection for silence. The answer settled painfully inside her. Margaret changed the subject gently. You finding enough supplies up here? I'm managing. That means no. Caroline smiled faintly despite herself. Margaret always spoke with the blunt warmth of someone who no longer cared about social politeness. As the storm worsened outside, conversation slowly shifted toward Cleveland, toward Nathan, toward Ryan. Caroline had avoided speaking openly about her son since arriving in Pine Hollow, because saying the truth aloud made it harder to deny. But tonight, exhaustion weakened her defenses. He planned everything before William died, she admitted quietly. Margaret's face darkened. You sure? Caroline nodded slowly. The paperwork was already prepared. The buyers were waiting. The facility had been chosen. Her voice trembled. I think Nathan saw me as a problem long before the funeral. Caleb leaned back thoughtfully. Did William ever discuss legal concerns with you? No. But he left letters. Caroline hesitated. Then she stood and retrieved William's note from the kitchen drawer. Caleb read it carefully while storm winds shook the farmhouse. By the time he finished, his expression had changed completely. This is serious, he said quietly. Caroline's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Your husband documented fraud concerns years ago. If evidence exists inside that safe. Caleb paused carefully. Nathan could face criminal charges. The words hung heavily in the room. Criminal charges. Caroline suddenly felt sick, no matter what Nathan had become. Part of her still remembered kissing scraped knees and packing school lunches. A mother's love did not disappear simply because it was betrayed. That was the cruelty of motherhood. Margaret reached across the table gently. You okay? Caroline stared at the fire. I don't know what okay means anymore. Silence followed. Then Caleb spoke carefully. You need to retrieve whatever's inside that safe before Nathan realizes it exists. Caroline looked up sharply. He doesn't know. If he did, that furnace would already be gone. The realization sent cold fear through her chest. Nathan still believed he controlled the situation. But if William truly hid legal evidence, everything could change. Outside, thunder cracked across the mountains. Margaret muttered under her breath. Roads will be impossible by morning. Caleb nodded absent-mindedly while rereading sections of William's letter. Then suddenly he looked at Caroline directly. You said the house buyers haven't moved in yet. Not fully, I think. Then you may still have access. Caroline's pulse quickened. You mean go back?
Yes.
Fear flashed across her face instantly. Back to Cleveland. Back to the house. Back to Nathan. Margaret noticed immediately. You don't have to decide tonight. But Caleb's voice remained calm and steady. Caroline listened carefully. Whatever William hid in that safe could be the difference between survival and disaster. The kitchen seemed smaller suddenly. The storm louder. Caroline wrapped trembling hands around her coffee cup. I don't think I'm strong enough for this. Margaret leaned forward immediately. That's exactly what Nathan wants you believing. The words struck hard because they were true. Nathan spoke to her like she was fragile, confused, dependent, and slowly she had begun seeing herself that way, too. Caleb folded William's letter carefully. Your husband clearly believed otherwise. Caroline looked toward the dark kitchen window, where snow swirled endlessly through pine trees. William believed she could survive this, but surviving meant facing truths she never wanted to see. Hours later, after the storm softened slightly, Margaret and Caleb prepared to leave before roads became completely impassable. At the door, Caleb paused. One more thing. Caroline looked at him. If Nathan committed fraud, he'll panic once he loses control of you. His expression grew serious. Men like that become dangerous when cornered. After they left, Caroline stood alone in the silent farmhouse, listening to the fading sound of their truck disappear through snow. Dangerous. William used the same word. She locked the front door carefully before sitting again beside the stove. The fire crackled softly while fear settled deep inside her stomach. Could Nathan truly become dangerous? Part of her rejected the idea immediately, but another part remembered his face the day he threw her out. Not guilt, not grief, impatience, as though removing his mother from her own home was merely unfinished business. Caroline closed her eyes painfully. Somewhere along the way, Nathan stopped seeing people emotionally. He only saw obstacles, assets, problems. And now she possessed something he did not know existed. The safe. William's evidence. The truth. For the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, Caroline understood that her husband's hidden preparations were not simply acts of love. They were warnings. And somewhere back in Cleveland, Nathan Perry was beginning to realize his mother had disappeared with secrets he could no longer control. Caroline Perry had not returned to Cleveland in nearly a month. Yet, the closer Margaret Hayes's truck moved toward the city, the tighter Caroline's chest became. The highway stretched endlessly beneath gray skies, while winter trees blurred past the windows. Beside her, Margaret drove silently, both hands gripping the wheel. Neither woman spoke much. There was nothing comforting left to say. Some journeys demanded courage instead of conversation. Caroline stared out the window as familiar buildings slowly reappeared in the distance. Cleveland's skyline rose cold and sharp against the clouds, bringing back memories she was not ready to face. William laughing while carrying groceries up the porch. Christmas lights hanging crooked across Maple Ridge Avenue. Nathan graduating high school. Ryan asleep on the couch after late-night movies. An entire lifetime waited somewhere inside the city. And so did betrayal. You still sure about this? Margaret asked quietly. Caroline swallowed hard. No. Margaret nodded once. That probably means you're thinking clearly. They reached Maple Ridge just after sunset. The neighborhood looked unchanged on the surface. Porch lights glowed warmly against snow-covered sidewalks. Children's bicycles rested near driveways. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Normal. That was what hurt most. The world continued looking ordinary, even after families destroyed each other. Margaret parked half a block away from the Perry house. Caroline's stomach twisted the moment she saw it. Lights glowed through the windows. Strangers lived there now. For several seconds, she could not breathe properly. That used to be my kitchen, she whispered faintly. Margaret rested a hand gently on her arm. You don't have to go inside alone. But Caroline already knew she had to, because fear had controlled too much of her life recently. The two women walked slowly through the cold evening air until they reached the front porch. Caroline noticed immediately that the maple tree William planted decades earlier still stood in the yard. Nathan had sold the house, but he had not managed to erase everything. Margaret knocked softly. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s wearing jeans and a gray sweater. She looked startled at first, then confused. Yes. Caroline's voice nearly failed her. My name is Caroline Perry. Recognition flashed instantly across the woman's face. Oh. A painful silence followed. You're the former owner. Former owner. The phrase cut deeply. Caroline forced herself to nod. I know this is strange. I'm sorry for disturbing you. The woman glanced between Caroline and Margaret carefully. My name's Denise Walker. Caroline clasped trembling hands together. There's something important still inside the basement. Something my husband hid years ago. Her voice cracked slightly. I only need a few minutes. Denise hesitated, not suspicious, uncomfortable. I heard some things about the sale after we moved in. She admitted quietly. Neighbors said your sons forced everything quickly. Margaret muttered under her breath. That's one word for it. Denise stepped back slowly. You should come in. Crossing the threshold nearly broke Caroline emotionally. The house smelled different now. Fresh paint, new furniture. Different candles burning somewhere in the kitchen. Yet beneath those changes, the soul of the house remained painfully familiar. William's staircase. William's hallway. William's home. Caroline gripped the banister briefly to steady herself. Denise noticed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Caroline shook her head weakly. "It isn't your fault." That part mattered deeply to her. Denise Walker was not the enemy. Nathan was. The basement door stood exactly where it always had. Caroline descended slowly, each creaking step pulling old memories behind it. Margaret followed closely while Denise remained upstairs respectfully. The basement smelled unchanged dust, metal, old concrete. The furnace still stood in the corner beneath dim yellow light. Caroline approached it with trembling hands. This time there was no hesitation, no denial left, only truth waiting to be uncovered. She knelt carefully beside the furnace and reached behind the metal panel William had shown her years ago. Cold steel touched her fingers. The safe was still there. Margaret exhaled sharply behind her. My God. Caroline's hands shook so badly she struggled to turn the dial. Wedding date. First apartment number. William's birthday. The lock clicked open. Silence swallowed the basement completely. For one terrifying second, Caroline could not move. Then slowly, she pulled the safe door open. Inside rested several thick envelopes, property folders, a small lockbox, and stacks of neatly organized documents tied with string. William had prepared everything carefully. Margaret crouched beside her. Caroline. But Caroline barely heard her. She lifted the first folder with numb hands. Financial statements, business records, copies of signatures. The deeper she searched, the colder she became. Nathan had stolen money from William's company for years. Not small amounts. Large transfers hidden through shell accounts and fake business expenses. Caroline's breathing became shallow. Oh God. Margaret read over her shoulder silently. Then came another document, a trust created solely in Caroline's name nearly 8 years earlier, protecting assets Nathan never legally touched. The farmhouse deed, insurance funds, emergency accounts. William had quietly shielded pieces of their life from their own son. Then Caroline found the photograph. Her blood turned cold instantly. Nathan stood beside a man in a dark suit, outside a downtown office building. Written across the back in William's handwriting were 5 words: Franklin Mills, fraudulent notary. Margaret stared at the image. That's evidence. But Caroline had already noticed something else inside the safe, a sealed envelope addressed in Ryan's handwriting. Her chest tightened painfully. Slowly, she opened it. Inside rested a folded confession dated nearly 4 years earlier. Dad, Nathan says nobody will get hurt if we move the money temporarily. He says Mom never needs to know because you'll fix everything before she notices. I know this is wrong. I know you're disappointed in me. I just don't know how to stop him anymore. Caroline closed her eyes. Ryan knew, not recently, years ago. The betrayal cut differently than Nathan's cruelty. Nathan had become hard, but Ryan had chosen silence, and silence had helped destroy her life. Tears slid quietly down Caroline's face. Margaret touched her shoulder gently. You okay? No, Caroline whispered honestly because at that moment, something inside her finally shattered completely. Not trust. That was already gone. Illusion. The illusion that this tragedy happened suddenly. William spent years quietly preparing for the collapse of their family, while Caroline continued setting holiday tables and pretending love could heal everything. She wiped her eyes slowly and continued searching through the safe. At the very bottom rested one final envelope, smaller, thinner, marked only with her name. Caroline opened it carefully. Inside was another note from William. If you're reading this, Then Nathan went further than even I feared. Listen to me carefully now, Carrie. Ryan is weak, but Nathan is dangerous when cornered. Do not confront him alone. Promise me that. Her stomach tightened instantly, because suddenly she understood. Nathan did not simply fear losing money. He feared exposure, criminal exposure, public disgrace. Everything he built depended on appearing successful, respectable, intelligent. If these documents surfaced, his entire life could collapse. Footsteps creaked overhead suddenly. All three women froze. Caroline's pulse exploded with panic. Another sound followed the front door opening upstairs. Then a familiar male voice. Nathan, I really don't think we should be here tonight. Ryan. Caroline's blood ran cold. Nathan answered sharply. She's hiding something. I know it. Margaret whispered instantly. We need to leave. But Caroline remained frozen beside the open safe, while fear crashed violently through her chest. Because after weeks of silence, her sons had finally found her. The basement suddenly felt too small. Caroline Perry stood frozen beside the open safe, while footsteps echoed overhead through the floorboards. Margaret Hayes grabbed the folders quickly, stuffing documents back into envelopes with trembling hands. We have to move, she whispered urgently. But Caroline could barely think. Nathan was upstairs, inside the house, inside William's house. The sound of his voice pulled old fear through her chest like a blade. Ryan spoke again above them, nervous and low. Nathan, maybe she really left town. She didn't vanish into thin air. Nathan snapped. Somebody's helping her. Caroline closed the safe quietly, while her pulse thundered in her ears. Margaret leaned close. Back staircase. Faintly. Years ago, William built a narrow exterior basement exit leading toward the side yard. The old wooden door was hidden behind shrubs near the fence line. Nathan rarely used it because he hated the basement entirely. Another detail William had remembered. Caroline gathered the envelopes carefully against her chest, while Margaret helped her toward the rear steps. Above them, floorboards creaked heavily. Nathan was moving through the kitchen now, closer. The basement door handle rattled suddenly. Caroline stopped breathing. Mum, Ryan called uncertainly. The handle turned halfway before stopping. Locked. Margaret whispered instantly. Go. They hurried toward the back exit just as Nathan's voice hardened upstairs. Why is the basement locked? Ryan answered weakly. Maybe the new owners. A loud bang interrupted him. Nathan had slammed something against the door. Caroline nearly stumbled climbing the narrow steps. Fear weakened her legs, but adrenaline pushed her forward. Behind them, another crash echoed through the basement. Nathan! Ryan shouted. Stop! The old lock splintered. Margaret shoved the exterior door open just as freezing wind burst inside. Move! The two women hurried into the snowy yard moments before Nathan entered the basement. Caroline heard him curse violently after discovering the open safe. Then came silence, the terrible kind. Margaret pulled Caroline toward the truck, parked down the block while snow whipped across the street. Inside the basement, Nathan Perry finally understood something catastrophic. His mother knew everything. By the time Margaret's truck reached the main road, Caroline's entire body was shaking uncontrollably. Margaret glanced at her repeatedly. You okay? No. The answer came immediately because nothing about this was okay anymore. Nathan's face when he discovered the safe would haunt her forever. Not sadness, not regret. Panic. Pure panic. The realization chilled her more deeply than the winter storm outside. Nathan was afraid. Not of losing his mother, of exposure. Back in Cleveland, Nathan stood alone inside the basement, staring at the empty safe with fury burning through him. Ryan hovered near the stairs, looking pale. Nathan. Shut up. Nathan grabbed one of the remaining loose papers scattered near the furnace. His eyes scanned the page rapidly before his expression darkened completely. She took everything. Ryan swallowed hard. Maybe we should just talk to her. Nathan turned so sharply Ryan flinched backward. Talk to her. Nathan hissed. Do you understand what happens if those documents surface? Ryan said nothing because he did understand. For years, he convinced himself Nathan would eventually fix everything. Repay the money, correct the fraud, protect the family name. But standing inside the ruined basement now, Ryan finally saw the truth clearly. Nathan never intended to stop. You lied to me? Ryan whispered. Nathan laughed bitterly. Oh, please don't suddenly grow a conscience now. Ryan's face tightened painfully. She's our mother, and she's about to destroy both of us. No, Ryan said quietly. You did that. Nathan stared at him coldly. For a moment, the brothers looked nothing alike, one polished by ambition, the other hollowed by guilt. Nathan stepped closer. If Mom goes public with this, everything disappears. Ryan lowered his eyes. Maybe that's exactly what should happen. Hours later, Margaret and Caroline finally reached Pine Hollow again just before dawn. Neither woman spoke much during the drive. The envelopes rested tightly in Caroline's lap the entire journey. Proof. Evidence. The destruction of her own family, reduced to paperwork. By morning, Caleb Whitmore sat at the farmhouse kitchen table, reviewing every document carefully, while Caroline watched silently from beside the stove. The retired attorney's expression grew grimmer with each passing minute. This is worse than I expected. Caroline's stomach tightened. How bad? Caleb removed his glasses slowly. Forgery, financial fraud, elder abuse, illegal property transfers. He looked directly at her. Nathan could face serious prison time. The word, prison, made Caroline physically ill. She sat down heavily at the table. I never wanted this. I know. Tears filled her eyes. I wanted my family. Caleb's voice softened. Caroline, families don't survive by protecting lies forever. Margaret placed fresh coffee near her quietly. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Caleb carefully lifted Ryan's confession letter. This changes things. Caroline looked up weakly. How? It proves Ryan cooperated, but also proves Nathan orchestrated the fraud. Caleb paused thoughtfully. And it may explain why Ryan seems terrified. Terrified. Yes, that word fit. Ryan was guilty, but he also looked trapped every time Nathan entered a room. Caroline hated herself for still feeling protective toward him. A mother's heart rarely followed logic. Later that afternoon, while snow drifted gently across Pine Hollow, someone knocked on the farmhouse door. Margaret immediately tensed. Caleb stood slowly. Caroline's pulse quickened, but when the door opened, Ryan Perry stood alone on the porch. He looked exhausted, broken. Snow covered his coat while dark circles hung beneath swollen eyes. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Ryan spoke softly. Mom, please. Caroline felt her entire body tighten. Margaret stepped protectively beside her. You've got nerves showing up here. Ryan ignored the insult. His eyes never left Caroline. I need to talk to you. Caleb spoke calmly. Nathan, know you're here. Ryan shook his head immediately. No. Why should we believe that? Because if Nathan knew, he'd already be here. That answer frightened Caroline because she knew it was true. After a long silence, she finally stepped aside. Ryan entered slowly. The farmhouse kitchen suddenly felt unbearably tense. Ryan looked older somehow, smaller, not physically, spiritually. Like years of guilt had finally crushed whatever remained inside him. His eyes landed on the envelope sitting atop the table. He understood instantly. You found it. Caroline nodded once. Ryan closed his eyes painfully. I told Dad Nathan would never stop. Silence filled the room. Then Caroline finally asked the question haunting her for weeks. Why didn't you stop him? Ryan looked at her helplessly. At first, I thought it was temporary. Then I thought I could fix it quietly. Tears filled his eyes. After a while, I was scared of him. Margaret crossed her arms sharply. Scared doesn't excuse abandoning your mother. I know. Ryan's voice cracked completely. I know. Caroline studied him carefully. For the first time since William died, she saw the full weight of Ryan's shame. Not polished like Nathan's lies, not manipulative, real. Still, pain remained pain. You stood there while he threw me out, she whispered. Ryan began crying openly now. I hated myself for it. But you still did it. The truth landed heavily between them. Ryan lowered his head. Yes, Caleb finally interrupted quietly. Ryan, if Caroline proceeds legally, Nathan will fight aggressively. Ryan nodded immediately. I know. Will you testify? The question changed everything. Ryan looked toward Caroline slowly. Fear moved visibly across his face. Not fear of prison. Fear of choosing between truth and blood. For nearly a full minute, nobody spoke. Then finally, Ryan whispered the words Caroline never expected to hear. Yes. Margaret exhaled softly. Caleb leaned back thoughtfully, but Caroline only stared at her son, broken, guilty, terrified, and finally honest. For the first time since this nightmare began, Caroline understood something painful but necessary. Nathan had chosen greed. Ryan had chosen weakness. And she would now have to choose whether justice mattered more than protecting what remained of her family. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and tension. Caroline Perry sat quietly beside Caleb Whitmore while snow melted slowly against the courthouse windows outside. Across the aisle, Nathan Perry adjusted the sleeve of his expensive navy suit with the calm confidence of a man who still believed appearances could save him. But today, appearances were cracking. The hearing had already drawn attention across Cleveland. Nathan's business reputation made the accusations impossible to ignore. Elder abuse, fraud, forged signatures, illegal property transfers. Reporters waited outside. Former clients whispered in hallways. And for the first time in his life, Nathan Perry could not control the narrative. Caroline studied her oldest son carefully. He looked tired, not guilty, tired. There was still anger in his posture, still arrogance in the way he avoided looking toward her side of the courtroom. But fear had finally entered him, too. She could see it around his eyes. Ryan sat several rows behind Caroline, pale and silent beside Margaret Hayes. He had agreed to testify days earlier, though the decision seemed to hollow him further each passing hour. The bailiff announced the judge's arrival. Everyone stood. Judge Rebecca Lawson entered with sharp eyes and calm authority. She wasted little time on ceremony once proceedings began. Nathan's attorney spoke first, a polished man with silver cufflinks and a carefully rehearsed voice. He painted Caroline as confused, grieving, emotionally unstable. After William's death, he argued, Nathan merely tried helping manage overwhelming financial responsibilities. Messes. Perry was vulnerable. The attorney explained smoothly. My client acted in good faith, attempting to provide structure and care. Care. The word nearly made Caroline laugh. Instead, she sat silently while years of sacrifice rose painfully inside her chest. Then Caleb stood. Everything changed. Unlike Nathan's attorney, Caleb spoke plainly. No performance, only facts. He presented the forged signatures first, then business records showing unauthorized transfers from Perry and Sons Plumbing into shell accounts connected to Nathan's real estate projects. The courtroom grew quieter with each document. Nathan stopped pretending confidence after the third folder. By the time Caleb introduced William's handwritten notes describing concerns about fraud, Nathan's jaw visibly tightened. Then came the trust documents. The illegal property sale details, the photographs linking Nathan to Franklin Mills, the corrupt notary. Judge Lawson studied each piece carefully while tension spread visibly across the courtroom. Nathan's attorney objected repeatedly, but facts continued piling higher. Finally, Caleb called Ryan Perry to the witness stand. Ryan looked physically ill walking forward. Caroline watched her youngest son carefully as he raised his hand and swore to tell the truth. For several seconds after sitting down, Ryan could barely speak. Then Caleb asked quietly, "Did your father confront Nathan about missing business funds years ago?" Ryan swallowed hard. "Wes. And were you aware fraudulent transfers continued afterward?" Ryan closed his eyes briefly. "Wes." Nathan stared at his brother with absolute fury. Ryan avoided looking at him. Caleb continued calmly. "Did Caroline Perry know about these activities?" "No, Po." "Did she knowingly approve the sale of her home?" "No." Ryan's voice cracked badly on the final word. The courtroom remained silent because everyone could hear what mattered most beneath his testimony: shame. Deep, unbearable shame. Nathan's attorney stood quickly for cross-examination. "Mr. Perry," he began sharply, "isn't it true you participated willingly in some financial transfers?" Ryan nodded weakly. "Yes." "So you benefited personally?" "Yes." "And now, facing potential legal consequences yourself, you're blaming your brother to protect your own interests." Ryan looked toward Caroline for one brief moment, then back at the attorney. "No." The single word sounded stronger than anything else he said all morning. The attorney pressed harder. "You expect this court to believe you suddenly developed a conscience?" Ryan's eyes filled with tears instantly. "No," he whispered. "I expect the court to believe I was weak." Silence followed. Even Judge Lawson paused slightly. Ryan lowered his head. "My father tried to stop this years ago. My mother trusted us, and I let Nathan convince me that fixing things later was enough." His breathing shook badly. But later never came. Caroline felt tears gathering despite herself, not because Ryan deserved immediate forgiveness, but because truth finally sounded honest coming from him. Nathan's attorney sat down shortly afterward. The damage was done. Then Caleb surprised everyone. He called Caroline Perry herself to the stand. Nathan finally looked directly at his mother for the first time all morning. Caroline walked slowly toward the witness chair. Her knees hurt. Her hands trembled slightly, but something inside her remained steady now, not anger, dignity. Caleb approached gently. "Mrs. Perry," he said softly, "how long were you married to William Perry?" 48 years. "And during those years, what role did you have in the family business?" Caroline smiled faintly through sadness. "Everything nobody notices. A few people shifted quietly in their seats." She continued, "I answered phones, managed appointments, paid bills when customers couldn't afford repairs, packed lunches, raised our sons while William worked." Her voice softened. "I built that life beside him." Caleb nodded carefully. "Did you ever authorize Nathan Perry to sell your home?" "No." "Did you willingly agree to move into assisted living?" "No." "Why not?" Caroline looked down briefly before answering. "Because I wasn't dying." The simplicity of the statement hit harder than emotion would have. Caleb stepped closer. "How did your sons treat you after William's death?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Caroline thought about the porch, the suitcases, Nathan's cold voice, Ryan's silence, and William's hidden safe waiting behind the furnace like a final act of protection. Finally, she answered quietly, "Like I had become inconvenient." Nathan looked away immediately. Caroline continued before emotion stopped her. "I spent my whole life believing sacrifice automatically creates loyalty. I thought if you loved people enough, they would protect you when you became vulnerable." Tears filled her eyes now. But love without honesty becomes permission. The judge listened carefully. So did everyone else. Caroline drew one shaky breath. My husband worked his entire life to build something decent. Not rich, decent. Her voice strengthened slightly. And after he died, my sons treated his life like paperwork to divide. Nathan suddenly stood. That's not fair. His attorney grabbed his arm immediately, but the outburst already exposed him. Judge Lawson's expression hardened. Sit down, Mr. Perry. Nathan obeyed reluctantly. Caroline looked at him across the courtroom. For the first time since his childhood, she saw him clearly without excuses, protecting her vision. Not evil, not monstrous. Just a man who valued success more than people for so long that eventually he stopped seeing the difference. And somehow that felt even sadder. By late afternoon, the hearing finally ended. Judge Lawson reviewed the evidence carefully before delivering temporary rulings. The sale proceeds from the house were frozen immediately, pending fraud investigation. Control of William Perry's remaining assets returned fully to Caroline. Formal criminal investigation into Nathan Perry and Franklin Mills was authorized, and most importantly, the court formally recognized Caroline Perry as a victim of financial exploitation and elder abuse. Nathan sat motionless while the rulings were read. His public image collapsed quietly in real time. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered immediately. Nathan avoided cameras completely. Ryan disappeared through a side exit with his head lowered. But Caroline stopped briefly at the courthouse steps. Snow drifted softly through the cold Cleveland air, while cameras waited nearby. For a moment she looked toward the skyline of the city, where she once believed her entire life would begin and end. Then she turned toward Margaret and Caleb, toward the people who helped her survive. And slowly, for the first time since William died, Caroline Perry realized something extraordinary. She was no longer fighting merely to reclaim what had been stolen. She was fighting to reclaim herself. Spring arrived quietly in Pine Hollow. Snow melted from the mountains in slow silver streams, while patches of green returned to the fields surrounding the farmhouse. Birds nested beneath the repaired porch roof, and sunlight once again reached the kitchen windows where Caroline Perry now stood most mornings with coffee warming her hands. The farmhouse no longer looked abandoned. Fresh blue paint covered the old siding. Window shutters had been repaired. New flower boxes rested beneath the front windows, overflowing with white daisies and lavender. And above the porch door hung a simple wooden sign, William's Hearth. Caroline traced the carved letters gently each time she passed beneath them, not because she lived in the past, but because love deserved remembrance when greed had tried to erase it. The legal battles in Cleveland continued for months after the hearing. Nathan Perry's business collapsed almost immediately once the investigation became public. Investors withdrew. Clients disappeared. Former partners suddenly claimed they had always felt uncomfortable around him. The newspapers called it a scandal, but Caroline knew the truth was much simpler. Nathan had spent years building a life designed entirely around appearance, and appearances eventually fail under truth. Franklin Mills lost his notary license and faced fraud charges. Several hidden financial accounts connected to Nathan were uncovered during investigation. Ryan avoided criminal prosecution after cooperating fully with authorities and returning what remained of his portion of the stolen funds. Still, consequences followed him too. Not legal ones, human ones. Guilt aged him faster than punishment ever could. Caroline saw it every time he visited Pine Hollow because Ryan visited often now. At first, Margaret hated it. "You're too soft-hearted," she muttered one afternoon while helping Caroline plant tomatoes behind the farmhouse. Caroline smiled faintly. "No," she answered quietly. "I'm just tired of losing people." Margaret snorted but said nothing else. The truth was more complicated than forgiveness. Caroline had not magically healed. Some wounds never closed completely. There were still nights she woke crying after dreaming about the old house on Maple Ridge Avenue. There were still moments when Nathan's cold voice echoed painfully inside her memory, and Ryan's silence during those terrible weeks after William's death still hurt deeply. But Caroline had learned something important in Pine Hollow. Bitterness demanded constant energy, and after nearly 80 years of life, she no longer wished to spend her remaining strength feeding pain. So instead of returning to Cleveland after the court victory, Caroline made a decision nobody expected. She let Denise Walker keep the house. Caleb nearly dropped his coffee when she first announced it. Caroline, legally, you could reclaim the property entirely.
I know.
Then why wouldn't you? Caroline looked toward the farmhouse windows glowing warmly against the evening dark. Because that house stopped being home the moment fear entered it. And she meant it. Maple Ridge Avenue held beautiful memories, but it also held betrayal now. William's hearth would be different. With the financial assets finally restored through William's trust, Caroline began rebuilding the farmhouse properly, not into luxury, into refuge. Margaret helped organize community donations. Nora Bennett collected books and furniture from church groups. Earl Simmons repaired plumbing and roofing without charging labor. Slowly, room by room, the old farmhouse transformed. The first woman arrived in late April. Her name was Helen Brooks, 73 years old, recently evicted after her husband's death left her drowning in medical debt. Then came Rosa Martinez, whose children moved to California and stopped answering calls. Then June Holloway, abandoned after losing her home to foreclosure. Each woman arrived carrying the same invisible weight Caroline once carried herself: humiliation, fear, the terrible belief that growing older somehow made them disposable. But inside William's hearth, nobody was treated like a burden. They cooked together, gardened together, sat beneath blankets during thunderstorms, sharing old stories and grief too heavy to carry alone. Sometimes laughter filled the kitchen so loudly Caroline imagined William smiling somewhere nearby. One afternoon in early May, Ryan arrived carrying lumber in the back of his truck. Without speaking much, he spent the entire day repairing a fence near the garden. Caroline watched quietly from the porch. The old Ryan occasionally resurfaced during moments like these. Not the frightened man who followed Nathan, but the boy who once cried over injured birds. As evening approached, Ryan finally sat beside her on the porch steps. For several minutes, they listened silently to crickets singing across the fields. Then Ryan spoke softly. "I saw Nathan yesterday." Caroline's expression remained calm. "How is he?" Ryan stared toward the mountains. "Angry." The answer surprised neither of them. Nathan still blamed everyone else for his collapse. The courts, Ryan, William, even Caroline herself. Accepting responsibility required humility. Nathan never learned. "Does he hate me?" Caroline asked quietly. Ryan swallowed hard. "I think." He paused carefully. "I think Nathan hates himself now, but he doesn't know how to live with it." The words settled heavily between them. Caroline closed her eyes briefly because beneath everything, the betrayal, the fraud, the humiliation, Nathan was still her son, and no mother entirely escapes that pain. A week later, while cleaning the living room fireplace, Caroline discovered something hidden beneath the mantel. Another letter. Her breath caught instantly. William's handwriting. With trembling hands, she carried it outside to the porch where evening sunlight painted the hills gold. Slowly she unfolded the paper. "My Carrie, if you found this letter, then you survived." Tears filled her eyes immediately. "I wish I could have protected you from all of this directly, but life rarely gives us that power. Sometimes the best we can do is leave behind enough truth for the people we love to find their own strength." Caroline pressed the paper gently against her chest. You always believed the safe behind the furnace was the important thing. It wasn't. The safe only held evidence. You were always the real treasure. A broken sob escaped her throat. After all the betrayal, after all the loneliness, William still saw her clearly. Not as a burden, not as weakness, as value, as home. Caroline continued reading through tears. If the boys failed you, that is their tragedy, not your shame. Do not spend the rest of your life apologizing for surviving people who forgot how to love properly. The sun dipped lower across Pine Hollow while wind moved softly through the trees surrounding William's hearth. Inside the farmhouse, women laughed around the dinner table. Life, messy, wounded, beautiful life. William's final words blurred beneath Caroline's tears. Grow old bravely, Carrie, and if possible, leave the door open for broken people trying to become human again. William. Caroline lowered the letter slowly. Then she looked around at the farmhouse, at the repaired porch, at the glowing windows, at the garden blooming beside the fence Ryan rebuilt with his own hands. Once she thought losing everything would destroy her. Instead, it revealed what mattered: not houses, not money, not appearances. Dignity, truth, compassion that survived betrayal, and the courage to rebuild after being discarded. As darkness settled gently over Pine Hollow, Caroline Perry rose from the porch chair and walked back inside William's hearth, where warmth, laughter, and second chances waited beyond the doorway.